All right, we've been bringing you extensive coverage throughout the day. It was the first day of the World Economic Forum Africa meetings outside the International Convention Centre in Cape Town. Protesters against gender-based violence made their voices heard. Let's find out what was happening inside the venue today. We're joined now by anchor Nzinga Qunta to wrap up the day. And Nzinga, let us know what happened. You're live for us in Cape Town in the International Convention Centre.
A very good evening to you, Francis, and to our viewers. The first day of the World Economic Forum meeting in Africa is drawing to a close. There's still a buzz in the ICC where the first day of the meetings has taken place. The theme of this year's meeting is inclusive growth and shared futures in the fourth industrial revolution. And throughout the course of the day, there have been plenary sessions focusing on, among other things, doing business in Africa, a survey of global CEOs, as well as travel competitiveness and drones on the African continent. Those are some of the discussions that have been taking place in the rooms in this hall. Outside, Francis, we saw a little bit earlier on protesters gathered bemoaning the state of women in South Africa, bemoaning the lack of safety and what they felt was government's ill response to the crisis that they say South African women are facing. Obviously a reaction to, among other things, the death of Uyinene Mrwetyana in Cape Town last week. The protesters there calling for President Cyril Ramaphosa to come out and address them, which did not take place. So that's what's been taking place here. We've been speaking to some political leaders and business leaders as well. Earlier on, I had the opportunity to speak to Zimbabwe's Finance Minister, Professor Mthuli Ncube, to ask him about the state of the Zimbabwean economy, as well as what's taking place in South Africa with the Afrophobic attacks that have been flaring up in different parts of our country. He's obviously condemning that and saying that though they have communicated with the South African government and that is being dealt with. I also had the opportunity to speak to Botswana's President, Mokgweetsi Masisi, who echoed the same sentiments and said that South Africans are neighbors with the rest of our continent and there needs to be a move to work together and not experience the kind of violence that we're experiencing. Also spoke to Shirley Mashaba, who is the CEO of PwC South Africa, on that survey on competitiveness and doing business on the African continent. And she said most CEOs were actually very confident about the state of South Africa, the state of business in the country, because although we are facing challenges, there is a sense that there's cooperation between government and things are moving forward. So that's what's taken place in the first day of the World Economic Forum. But for more on this, I'm joined by participant Busisiwe Mavuso, who is from BLSA. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News tonight. Talk to us about what you've experienced at the World Economic Forum and in particular what's been raised when it comes to youth and Africa.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for inviting me. So it has been a very interesting session, and it's actually interesting how much of the challenges that we're facing as a continent actually resonate with us as South Africa. So the issue that you're raising on youth unemployment, staggering numbers that have been shared. The fact that 60% of unemployed people in the continent are youth. You know, the fact that there's 12 million youth who are actually entering the job market each year, but only 10% of them are absorbed in the formal economy, and the rest of the 90% are actually left to do menial jobs, you know, and how that conversation segued to the importance of our education system. How do we ensure that our education system is relevant in terms of preparing our youth to be competitive from a global perspective? So I think that was a very interesting conversation that we had, but it also raises very critical issues to say that we are not far behind in as far as the, you know, challenges that we're facing as a continent as South Africa. It therefore ought to ask, you know, or rather to make us ask the question to say that what are we doing about it as a continent? You know, if we are saying that youth unemployment is Africa's biggest ticking time bomb, you know, what are the interventions that we're putting in place to ensure that we arrest this? But most interesting on this unemployment issue was the fact that on average the African countries have unemployment of about 23%, you know, and yet we're sitting at 28% as South Africa. So therefore, as a country that achieved its democracy last in the continent, I would have thought we should have learned, you from our sister countries in Africa, but it doesn't look like it's the case. And that conversation also segued very interestingly on the politics in Africa, how politics are actually disenfranchising the economics in this continent, how politics are actually not assisting in moving this continent forward, how politicians in particular are inexpedient in dealing with some of the issues that we're facing as a country, how we are where we are as a continent precisely because our politicians are not focusing on the things that we ought to be focusing on, how the crisis that we have as a continent is as a result of political inexpediency. So when you look in terms of where we are as a country, at the brink of economic collapse, some of the paralysis that we've seen after May 8th in terms of our politics, how some of the interventions and the decisions that we ought to be making as a country are just not coming through. The issue around the visas, the issue around fixing ESCOM, the issue around the independence of the Reserve Bank, the issue around the prescribed assets. It just tells you, to say that these are precisely the, things that have made the African continent. It actually gives true the adage that Africa is indeed, poor by choice, because we ought not to be poor as a country. But because the state of our politics is such that it confines our economic growth, we are where we are. Very interesting discussion again on the importance of the infrastructural reforms that we have as a continent and how that positions us, as an investment destination, to say that there is a direct correlation towards infrastructure spend, and the ease of doing business and the capital inflows coming into the country, into the continent and such things. And the fact that we have set up an infrastructure fund as a country therefore tells me that we are in the right direction. But the thing that is missing is how are we ensuring that we are focusing indeed on those things that we ought to be focusing on. So the political turbulence that we're currently seeing in the country is actually not helping. So I'm hoping that we live from this to take those important lessons and implement them.
Thank you so much for your time on SABC News tonight. Busisiwe Mavuso from BLSA giving us an insight into what she's experienced and the many discussions that have taken place. Today, the World Economic Forum meetings continue bright and early, and we'll be here from the morning until the evening, making sure you are updated as to what's going on, the discussions that are taking place, and speaking to some of the biggest names who are attending here. Francis, with that, it's back to you in studio.